Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk.
Great to be here.
Okay, picture this. A major global power states, pretty emphatically, that it's the most democratic country on earth.
Right.
But then when you look closer, you don't really see the things maybe you'd expect, like competitive multi-party elections or a judiciary operating completely independently. You see a lot of control over speech, over information.
Yeah, it seems like a contradiction, a real paradox.
Exactly. So how does that work? What definition of democracy are they actually using?
And that paradox is precisely what we're digging into today.
Yeah.
Using the source materials you shared, we're looking at China's specific concept. They call it whole process people's democracy.
Right.
And then we'll unpack the, significant international reaction and criticism of that whole claim.
So our mission today, unpack these sources, really try to understand the argument China is making on its own terms first. Then lay out the criticisms, the challenges to it.
And also look at how language itself becomes kind of a battleground in this whole thing. It's fascinating.
Okay, let's jump in. So the central idea, the term we keep seeing pop up in the sources, especially pushed by Xi Jinping since around 2019, is this whole process people's democracy.
Yeah, and based on the sources, their core argument seems to be this. Look, democracy isn't just about showing up and ticking a box on election day.
Okay.
They argue it's this continuous ongoing thing. And the real test, the real measure of it, is whether the system actually addresses people's needs, solves their problems effectively, like from beginning to end.
Right. So it's less about the specific act of voting and more about the system's overall function and, importantly, its outcomes.
Exactly. And the sources break down some key features, they say, demonstrate this whole process idea. One big one is institutional participation. This happens mainly through their National People's Congress, the NPC system. And the scale is pretty massive. The numbers cited are quite striking.
Yeah, I saw that. In 2020, what was it, 2.62 million representatives?
Across all levels, yeah. And get this, 94.5% of those were at the county and township levels. So they present that as evidence of really broad grassroots level representation woven into the fabric of the system.
Okay, so a huge number of representatives, particularly at the local level. What else is part of this process?
Well, they also really emphasize something called consultative democracy.
Right.
This involves different platforms like the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the CPPCC, but also other ways they bring in experts, various social groups, different sectors.
To give input.
Exactly, to provide suggestions, feedback on policy, on governance. And the sources point to the activity level here, like over 170 consultation forums, more than 730 proposals submitted since 2012. They frame this as listening to lots of different voices within their structure, of course.
Oh, okay. So participation through reps, consultation for input. And then maybe the biggest piece of their argument seems to be about the results.
Absolutely. That falls under what they call governance efficacy and being results-oriented, meaning the proof of their democracy, the legitimacy, isn't just in how things are discussed or decided, but in the concrete, tangible improvements they deliver to people's lives. That's the ultimate test, in their view.
And the sources list specific examples they use to back this claim up, don't they?
They do. Things like getting over 1.3 billion people covered by basic medical insurance.
Huge number.
Over 1 billion with pension coverage. And the really big one, the claim of eliminating absolute poverty.
Right.
These are presented as the direct results, the fruits of their democratic system being effective, proving it works for the people.
Yeah, and there's that quote, the really telling one from their 2021 white paper on China's democracy that's in the sources. It says something like, democracy is not an ornament,
but to be used to solve the problems the people want to solve.
Yeah, that's the one.
And they explicitly contrast this with Western-style voting, calling it too formalistic.
Exactly. They argue their model is more practical, more substantial, because it focuses on delivering those outcomes. So if we're really trying to see it from their perspective, based on these sources, the benchmark for democracy isn't primarily the ballot box, it's whether the system improves lives and solves national problems. That's the essence of whole process people's democracy.
That's the case they're making, yes, according to the materials we have here.
Okay, now let's pivot. How does this definition, this whole claim, stack up when you look at it from, say, the U.S. or European perspective? Because the standards used there to define democracy, as these same sources point out, seem, well, pretty different.
Oh, absolutely. Very different. When the sources turn to the international critique, they lay out the sort of foundational pillars of Western liberal democracy.
Like what?
Things like regular elections, crucially multi-party elections that are considered free and fair. The act of voting itself is really central. It's seen as the main way citizens express their choice and give consent to be governed.
Right. Elections is the key accountability mechanism. What else is fundamental from that view?
Freedom of the press and freedom of speech are huge. The underlying idea is that citizens absolutely need the ability to freely monitor their government, to criticize it, to express a whole range of opinions without fearing punishment.
Okay, so open criticism is vital.
And then there's the principle of an independent judiciary, plus a system of checks and balances between different branches of government. These are specifically designed to stop any one person or group from getting too much power.
Makes sense.
And maybe most fundamentally, political pluralism. The idea that you have multiple competing political parties and ideologies, that's just inherent to the model, and it directly opposes the concept of one-party rule.
And this is exactly where the criticisms outlined in the sources get really pointed when looking at China's system.
Yeah, from that Western liberal democratic standpoint, the Chinese system seems to miss the mark on several basic points.
Like the most obvious one.
The lack of universal suffrage for national leaders, and the complete absence of any real opposition parties. The Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, effectively holds a monopoly on political power. There's just no framework for the kind of multi-party competition understood elsewhere.
And even the elections they do have, like for the NPC firms we mentioned, they face heavy criticism too, right?
Definitely. Critics argue they aren't genuinely free. The sources mention that the party vets the nominations for these representatives. And crucially, citizens can't directly vote for their top national leaders in a nationwide ballot. It's seen as a system managed by the party, not one where leaders are directly chosen by the people through competitive elections.
Okay, so the election process itself is questioned. What else?
Well, another major point of criticism is the suppression of dissenting voices. The sources are pretty clear on this. State control over the media is widespread, and they point to the silencing, sometimes even the arrest, of activists, lawyers, petitioners, people who try to speak out or challenge the status quo. They name specific individuals like Li Qiaochu and Xu Zhong as examples of this.
And tied into that is the whole issue of transparency, or rather the lack of it, what the sources call information opacity.
Exactly. Very little truly independent media exists within China. And strict internet censorship, the Great Firewall, makes it really hard for citizens to access information that isn't approved or filtered by the state, or to express critical views online without risk.
And this critical view isn't just opinion, it's backed up by data from groups that track these things globally.
Yeah, the sources cite Freedom House, for instance. Their 2024 rating gives China a score of just 9 out of 100.
9 out of 100.
Labeling it not free. And they contrast that with scores like 83 for the U.S. or 94 for Taiwan in the same report. It shows a massive gap when measured against those specific criteria for political rights and civil liberties.
That 9 out of 100 really crystallizes the difference in assessment. So when you take those core principles, free elections, opposition, free speech, independent checks, and compare them to what the sources describe about China's system, it really makes you, the listener, pause and think. Can these two very different approaches both genuinely be called democracy, using the same word, especially by those international standards?
It starkly highlights the fundamental clash in definitions that we're grappling with here. It's not just a semantic debate. It goes to the core of what political systems value.
Absolutely. Okay, let's move from the official definition and the external critiques to something specific mentioned in the sources, a slogan often used within China, one that, on the surface, sounds incredibly democratic. The people are the masters of the country.
Right. It sounds like ultimate sovereignty rests with the citizens. Power to the people, essentially.
But as the sources quickly point out, critics see a pretty major gap, a contradiction between that powerful-sounding slogan and the political reality described.
Yeah, a disconnect.
Let's dig into some of the specific areas where critics see this disconnect, based on the source material we have. Let's take the election issue again.
Okay.
The sources state clearly, people cannot directly elect their national leaders via ballot. Even the NPC elections involve party vetting. So the critical question becomes, if the people are truly the masters, the owners, why can't they hire and fire their top managers or servants through a direct vote?
It's a very direct challenge to the slogan's premise, isn't it?
Yeah.
Then there's the matter of speech and supervision.
If you're the master, you should be able to speak your mind or
Yeah.
criticize the management.
Logically, yes. Masters should have the right to freely criticize and oversee their government. But the reality painted in the sources includes that tight party control over media we discussed.
And the suppression of critics.
Exactly. Dissenters, petitioners trying to get grievances heard, even workers striking for better conditions. The sources bring up the 709 lawyers incident as a stark example human rights lawyers targeted just for trying to use the existing legal system.
So the question critics ask is, how can the supposed masters of the country be unable to speak freely to or independently supervise their servants in government?
It seems contradictory. Another area is decision-making power.
Who calls the shots on the big stuff?
Well, the sources describe major national policies, economy, foreign policy, defense. How they handle the pandemic is being decided largely by the CCP elite.
Often behind closed doors.
Often through opaque processes, yeah. With no clear mechanism described for widespread, transparent citizen participation or ultimate say in those huge decisions. Again, if the people are masters, shouldn't they have a more direct role or at least better visibility into the major choices affecting their lives and their country?
It raises fundamental questions about where power actually resides.
And one more area the sources touch on is wealth distribution. They mention data, like from Credit Suisse in 2023, suggesting the richest 1% in China hold a very significant chunk of the national wealth, over 30%.
What?
And they note mentions in some source material about party elites potentially having substantial assets, maybe even offshore, while ordinary citizens might struggle to get grievances about inequality or unfairness addressed effectively.
So the critics find that ironic.
Deeply ironic, yeah. The question becomes, isn't it strange if the masters, the people, are generally poorer and have less recourse than the stewards or servants managing the country's affairs and wealth?
Putting all those points together, the limits on elections, speech, decision-making, the wealth disparity, how do critics interpret that people are the masters slogan then?
Based on the sources, they tend to see it less as a reflection of reality and more as a political tool.
A tool for what?
Primarily for legitimizing the CCP's one-party rule. By claiming the party represents the people and the people are the masters, it allows them to frame any criticism of the party as being inherently anti-people or even unpatriotic.
So criticizing the party becomes criticizing the masters themselves.
That's the framing critics point to. The sources highlight how loving the country often gets explicitly equated with loving the party.
And there was that quote from the Harvard scholar Tony Sage mentioned in the sources. What did that say again?
Yes, that Chinese people's high life satisfaction doesn't mean they are masters of the system, but lack comparison and alternatives.
Right. That suggests satisfaction might come from things like economic improvement, but not necessarily from feeling politically empowered or in control.
Exactly. It adds nuance, suggesting that satisfaction and being the master aren't necessarily the same thing.
So the takeaway from the critical view is that the slogan serves a vital political purpose for the party, but seems to have a serious disconnect from the lived political realities described in these sources.
That sums up the critical perspective presented, yes.
Okay, building on that idea of words meaning different things, another really fascinating thread in the sources is how China appears to redefine key political terms. Critics, as noted, sometimes call this language manipulation, or even use the term Orwellian.
Yes, and it has a really significant effect. It makes having a clear conversation about the system using standard international definitions incredibly difficult. It can feel, as you said earlier, a bit like linguistic gymnastics, or just confusing.
Yeah, mind-bending was the word I used. Let's walk through some examples the sources provide. Take democracy itself, our main topic.
Okay.
The common understanding in many places centers on contested elections, voting for leaders. But, as we've hammered home, the CCP's whole process definition pivots away from the vote towards the continuous process and, crucially, the results achieved. It keeps the word, but changes the core meaning.
Completely reframes it, or take rule of law.
Right.
Internationally, that usually implies everyone, including the government and the ruling party, is subject to and accountable under the law, overseen by an independent judiciary.
Equal before the law.
Exactly. But the sources suggest that in the Chinese context, it functions more like rule by law. The law becomes a tool used by the party to govern and maintain order, rather than a force the party itself is consistently subservient to.
So the law serves the party, not the other way around.
That's the critical interpretation. Then there's speech freedom?
Guaranteed in the Constitution, apparently.
On paper, yes. But the reality described in the sources, as we've covered, includes widespread censorship, filtering of sensitive words online, monitoring, and the silencing or punishment of voices deemed critical or disruptive. So the freedom exists formally, but is severely constrained in practice.
Harmony is another interesting one the sources mention. Sounds lovely, right? Social stability, peace.
Who wouldn't want harmony? But the sources note that, in practice, it's often invoked to justify cracking down on any dissent, protest, or expression that could disturb the party's desired social order.
So things like deleting critical posts online
Can be framed as maintaining harmony. Dissent isn't seen as a healthy part of public discourse, but as a threat to stability that needs to be managed or removed.
which leads neatly into patriotism.
Yeah. Conventionally, loving your country, your people, your culture. But the sources stress how, in the official narrative, patriotism is frequently conflated with loyalty and support for the CCP itself.
So the implication is
That if you don't support the party, you don't love your country. It makes criticism of the ruling party seem inherently unpatriotic.
that's a powerful conflation. What about anti-corruption?
Presented as a major campaign, zero tolerance for graft. And undoubtedly, some corruption has been tackled. But the sources also point to analysis and observations suggesting that the campaign has, at times, appeared intertwined with political maneuvering.
Like purging rivals.
That perception exists, yes.
Yeah.
High-profile cases like Zhu Yongkang or Bo Xilai are often cited in this context. It raises questions about whether it's purely about clean governance or also about consolidating power.
Blurs the lines. And finally, news freedom.
Instead of valuing independent media that holds power accountable, a cornerstone of press freedom elsewhere, the emphasis described in the sources is squarely on party-controlled media.
Doing what?
Focusing on positive propaganda, promoting the party's narrative, guiding public opinion, and reinforcing the party line, independent investigative journalism faces huge obstacles.
The sources even mentioned some really specific, almost quirky examples of this control, didn't they? Like the Rubao culture.
Yeah, that term critics use for how official party newspapers sometimes seem to print identical propaganda points across the country. And of course, the famous censorship of Winnie the Pooh.
Just because people online compared him to Xi Jinping.
Apparently so. It shows how sensitive and far-reaching the censorship can be, even extending to cartoon characters.
Those examples definitely make you stop and think, don't they? It really underscores how actively language is being shaped and controlled.
It does.
So, according to the critics cited in the sources, what's the ultimate goal behind all this redefinition? Why do it?
The sources suggest it's primarily a strategy to control the narrative, both inside China and on the world stage. Well, it helps blur the reality on the ground for citizens. It makes it harder for outsiders to critique the system using standard terms because you have to engage with their specific altered definitions. It guides public thinking domestically. And it helps counter international narratives that might challenge the party's legitimacy. Essentially, it's about shaping perception by controlling the very language used to describe political reality.
Okay, so let's try to tie all these threads together. We've looked at China's definition of whole process people's democracy. We've contrasted that with the international critiques based on different standards. We've explored the contradictions critics see in the people are the masters slogan. And now we've discussed this fascinating element of redefining key political terms.
Right.
It all seems to circle back to that initial fundamental question. Based on everything in these sources, is China's model of democracy actually better than others?
And, based purely on the material we've reviewed today, the answer seems to be it completely depends on whose definition of democracy you're using. There's no single answer here.
Right. If your benchmark is those widely accepted international standards, things like free and fair multi-party elections, protected speech, independent judiciary, checks and balances, political pluralism,
then the sources we looked at strongly suggest that China's current system doesn't meet those criteria. The Freedom House score alone points to that conclusion from that specific perspective.
Okay. But
if you adopt China's own definition, the one centered on solving problems, maintaining stability, delivering tangible results through that whole process, then they point to their achievements. Poverty alleviation, healthcare expansion, infrastructure development. These are presented as evidence that their system, by their measure, is effective and successful, perhaps even superior in delivering practical benefits.
And the sources really lay out these different perspectives side by side, don't they?
You do. You have the official CCP view. Our democracy work for China? It has Chinese characteristics. Western democracy is flawed and chaotic.
Then the view common in much of the Western media and many governments. It's not democracy as we understand it. It's authoritarianism cleverly packaged using democratic language, a form of narrative control.
Then you have the assessments from third-party research organizations like Freedom House or VDEM using their specific metrics, which consistently classify China as authoritarian, finding little evidence of what they would define as an effective democratic system.
And finally, that interesting data on Chinese public opinion.
Yeah, surveys from places like Pew or Harvard that often show high levels of reported satisfaction with the central government's performance among Chinese citizens.
But with that important caveat mentioned in the sources.
Exactly. The caveat that this satisfaction exists within an environment of significant information control and limited alternatives, which could influence how people respond or what they compare their situation to.
It paints a really complex, multi-layered picture with no easy answers.
Definitely not. So, to kind of summarize the overall situation presented in the sources, China has deliberately redefined democracy in a way that aligns with and legitimizes its existing one-party system. They emphasize results and stability over the processes typically associated with democracy internationally.
But that redefinition, while central to their own narrative,
is largely viewed internationally, based on the critiques in these sources, as political rhetoric, a way to bolster legitimacy rather than a description of a system that meets globally understood democratic norms.
Wow. It's been quite a journey through definitions, critiques, and the power of language itself.
It really makes you realize how much weight words like democracy carry and how differently they can be interpreted and used.
Which leads us perfectly into a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. If different major political systems define fundamental concepts like democracy, freedom, rule of law, in ways that are not just different, but potentially fundamentally opposed, how can we ever truly understand each other? How can we have meaningful dialogue or even effective critique across those divides? What does democracy really mean to you personally beyond any single government's definition?
That's a big question. Definitely something to think about long after this deep dive ends.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. As we explored the sources around China's claim to be the most democratic country, it certainly revealed layers of complexity.
It really shows how politics and language are just so deeply intertwined.
If you found this exploration valuable, if it got you thinking, please do subscribe to the podcast. That way you won't miss our future deep dives into other complex and fascinating topics.
We really appreciate you tuning in.
And hey, just a quick shout out based on the notes here. Check out our old friend Micky's YouTube channel. Apparently, he's got some new wine videos up.
Oh, right. Wine, memes, music, travel vlogs. Always entertaining stuff. Definitely worth a look if you need a break from political definition.
For sure. Give Micky's channel a visit. Thanks again for listening, everyone.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.